It began more than 10 years ago in Moscow when financier Bill Browder hired lawyer Sergei Magnitsky to figure out what happened to millions of tax dollars that his company, Hermitage Capital Management, had paid to the Russian government. And after Magnitsky was beaten to death in custody, it has led to a decade-long crusade to get legislation passed around the world to battle corruption and human rights violations. Bill Browder recounts the details in his memoir. It's called Red Notice, a true story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice. And we're pleased to welcome him to our studio tonight. Bill, it's good to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Great to be here.
Before we talk about Canada's version of the Magnitsky Act, which just passed, I think it's worth spending a bit of time here just finding out who this man was. You knew him well. Tell us about Sergei.
So I had a business in Russia, an investment management business in Russia, and Sergei was one of my lawyers. And Sergei was, over the course of my business, one of the smartest lawyers that we had worked with. He worked for an American law firm.
Young guy, right?
He was in his mid-30s, young guy with a young family, a wife, 2 children, a mother, and just a really decent, principled young man, sort of what I would describe as the good face of, the face of Russia as one would hope it to be.
As he did his work, he uncovered what turned out to be a scam of massive proportions, $230 million worth of scandal over there, and he couldn't let it go. And that ended up getting him in the end, didn't it?
Well, so Sergei uncovered a massive $230 million government corruption scheme where government officials stole $230 million of tax money that we paid. Sergei uncovered it, he exposed it, he testified against the officials involved, and those same officials then arrested him, tortured him for 358 days in prison, and killed him on November 16th, 2009. And since then, I've been on a mission to get justice for Sergei.
Interestingly enough, he always believed in Russia. He believed that if he just told the truth as he knew it, that the law would exonerate him and someday he would go free. He was wrong to do that, wasn't he?
He was what I call a stubborn idealist. He really did believe in the law at every step of the way. When we discovered this crime and when the officials knew that we had discovered it, they started to chase our lawyers, including Sergei, inside of Russia. And the other lawyers, and Sergei, I said, let's get you out of the country. Why don't you come to London where it's safe?
Where you lived.
Where I lived. Mm-hmm. And everybody else accepted my proposal, but Sergei said, no, I've not broken any laws. This is not 1937, Stalin's Russia. I'm going to stay, and I'm going to expose this. And he stayed and exposed it, and it cost him his life.
Let's go back and do a bit of background here, because I think we need to also better understand. You were sort of the first major guy from the West into Russia as a foreign investor and became the #1 guy there because you had a knack for being able to look at, as Russia was privatizing and going from communism to capitalism, you could look at undervalued resources and invest in them. And of course, when the value went up, everybody made lots of money. When you were first trying to do that, how ethical was the business scene in Russia?
Well, the whole world in Russia was completely sort of Wild West. So what had happened was they had gone from communism to capitalism, and they gave away a lot of assets to the people of Russia for free, but they hadn't set up, it was like building a house without creating the plumbing or electricity. And so the plumbing and electricity in this case was laws and property rights and so on. And so we would buy shares of companies, but all the assets in the companies and the cash flow was being stolen out the back door by the Russian oligarchs, the people who own these companies. And so it was this terrible Wild West situation where everything was really cheap. The shares were cheap, they were undervalued, they were at a huge discount to the West, but they were cheap for a reason, and the reason was because there was just monumental stealing going on inside these companies.
But if business likes predictability, and that was clearly one of the most unpredictable scenarios you could invest in, why do business there?
Well, my logic was very simple. It traded at a 99.9% discount to the value of similar companies in the West. So it traded at 0.1% of a comparable company in the West, like an oil company or whatever. And my logic was, okay, all you have to do to make 10 or 20 times your money is for them not to take it away from you. And so I was making a bet, and my bet was very simple. Let's say there's a 50% chance they're going to take everything away from you, and a 50% chance you're going to make 10 or 20 times your money. Those are pretty good odds. And so I told my clients, just take a tiny fraction of your net worth, and I'll manage it for you, and we'll either lose it all or make 10 or 20 times the money. And a lot of people actually ended up making a lot more than 10 or 20 times their money with me.
But one of the things I don't hear in that calculation is the notion that you might have to pay with your life for making a bad decision. And that happened.
Right. So for me, it was all the risk reward of like making money or losing money. There was never any someone's going to get killed, and that haunts me to this day.
All right, let's return to the Magnitsky Act. This is an act of certainly of the United States government. Our country has passed it. I think Estonia has passed a version of it as well.
Yep.
This thing has tentacles now. It's an act named after your former tax lawyer that we talked about. And give us the general understanding of what this act is supposed to do.
Well, so when we were first looking at criminal justice in Russia for the murder of our lawyer, we said, how do we get justice in Russia? They said, we're not going to give you any justice in Russia. Putin personally got involved, exonerated every single person, gave special honors and promotions to some of the people most complicit. So we said, okay, let's get justice outside of Russia. And the idea on that is that all these guys who steal this massive amounts of money in Russia, they don't keep it in Russia, they keep it in the West. They keep it in US banks and Canadian banks and British banks. And they buy properties all over the world and they send their kids to private schools. And so we said, let's ban their visas and freeze their assets. And that's what the Magnitsky Act is a law that freezes assets and bans visas of the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky and the people who do similar types of atrocities in Russia or anywhere else in the world.
Now, the law just passed in Canada, so it's really far too early to say whether or not it's working, but it's been in place in the United States for a little longer. Is it working there?
Oh my God, is it working? So it's working in a number of different ways. So for example, one of the most famous political prisoners of our time in Russia is a guy named Michael Khodorkovsky. He was the owner of an oil company called Yukos he fell out with Putin 10 or 12 years ago.
It was the biggest oil company in Russia, wasn't it?
They seized his oil company, they stuck him in jail for 10 years, and he came out of jail a couple of years ago, and I've come to know him and be friends with him, and he told me that when the Magnitsky Act passed, the conditions, or I should say the treatment of prisoners in the prison where he was, improved dramatically because the prison guards were all afraid of being sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act. So that's the first reason I know it works, because people from the prisons actually told me. But the second reason, and this is the most interesting, is Putin's reaction to the Magnitsky Act. Putin has just gone off of his head in anger because of this piece of legislation. In America, he banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American families. He put Sergei Magnitsky on trial 3 years after they killed him in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia. And then just last week, after the Canadian Magnitsky Act passed, Putin put me on the Interpol list for the 5th time.
What does that mean?
That means that if I cross any border, I will be arrested.
Any border in Europe?
Any border anywhere.
Any border anywhere in the world.
The guy types in your passport, and he says, oh, Interpol, arrest this man. They don't know my story. They haven't read my book. These guys only know that there's an arrest warrant for me.
Okay, so you're not a Canadian citizen. So did you have any trouble getting into Canada?
Well, thankfully, the Interpol, after the huge political scandal of this, so Putin has used Interpol, tried to use Interpol 5 times. Interpol is a decent organization with rules, and they don't like this kind of stuff, and they've rejected his approach 5 times. And so last Thursday was the 5th time that Interpol rejected their warrant. And so I traveled here last night, and it was smooth sailing right through.
Uneventful getting through. Your case study is really I was going to say it's a case study in democracy in many respects, because you made the determination that you wanted to get this anti-corruption law passed as it related to Mr. Magnitsky, and as a result, you had to deal with a lot of different politicians down south. And I want to just name a few names here, and give me like a bullet point on each one of them as to how helpful or not they were in helping to get the Magnitsky Act passed. For example, former presidential candidate, Senator John McCain.
John McCain was one of the 2 main heroes, political heroes in this story in the United States. He through force of character and will, he and Senator Benjamin Cardin, who I hope you mention next, together on a bipartisan basis, Republican and Democrat, said this is just not right, that Russian torturers and murderers can come to America and spend their money here. We're going to stop them. And those 2 gentlemen, Senators John McCain and Senator Benjamin Cardin, basically were the fathers of the Magnitsky Act movement. They were the ones who started the whole thing off.
Let me offer up another former presidential candidate. This is former Secretary of State, former Senator former presidential candidate John Kerry. How about him?
He was our main opponent. He was the one. So I've always joked that the Magnitsky Act was pretty easy because there's no lobby for Russian torturers and murderers in Washington. But there was one person who was on their side, and it was John Kerry. John Kerry wanted to be the Secretary of State. It was going through his committee in the Senate. President Obama didn't want the Magnitsky Act passed because it would upset his relations with Russia.
Which he was trying to reset.
He had this thing called the Russian reset.
Yep.
And so, as a result, Senator Kerry, who was interviewing for a job as Secretary of State at the time, he was told, don't let this go through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of which he was chairman. And for like a year and a half, it just sat in his committee. It just got blocked, and nobody could do anything about it. And it was only through some very clever political maneuvering at the last minute that we got it around John Kerry.
And it did go through his committee unanimously, I think, didn't it?
It did, but it was only through a very sort of ugly political deal that had to be done.
Canada's current Foreign Affairs Minister, Chrystia Freeland, whom you knew back in her days when she was a journalist. How about her?
So Chrystia, again, is one of the heroes of this story in Canada. So I knew Chrystia when she was the Financial Times bureau chief in Moscow. She was the first journalist to write about my anti-corruption campaigns over there. We've stayed in touch through all the different iterations of her career. And then there was a time here in Canada when Irwin Cotler, who I hope you mention, if you don't, I will, Irwin Cotler, who's your former justice minister and an amazing man, Irwin proposed the Magnitsky Act here. It was then going through Parliament when he was in the opposition. It came to the election, and everybody agreed to the Magnitsky. All parties said they would do the Magnitsky Act. The Trudeau government was elected, and then the previous foreign minister, Stéphane Dion, blocked it.
He was going to be next on my list, so he was opposed to it.
So he blocked it, just like John Kerry blocked it. And he has never explained his reasons for blocking it, and I still don't understand that. And then all of a sudden, he was put into a new job. Chrystia shows up, and she completely turns the whole situation around. And thank God for Chrystia. She's a hero in Canada to me and many other people for what she's done with the Magnitsky Act.
Let me get your view then on some of the developments as we know them today, which is that there is this special investigation going on in the United States, led by the former director of the FBI, Mr. Mueller. We are starting to see charges. We are starting to see people arrested. We are starting to see the fruits of their labors come to fruition. What do you make of it?
Well, it's a very big deal. So you have a situation where Russia has successfully interfered in the U.S. political process. That's not uncertain. Everybody knows that happened. It's been confirmed by 17 intelligence agencies. Russia was hacking emails, exposing emails. They were buying up Twitter bots. They were doing Facebook ads. They were targeting voters. They were doing all this kind of stuff to try to get Trump elected. And so that is an interference of massive proportions by a hostile power in a major Western political process, and that needs to be fixed. Mueller, who is an absolutely amazing, high-quality investigator with a team of unbelievably good people underneath him, are now investigating this. The first indictments were issued today. There will be more. What we don't know so far is we've seen the details of one of the indictments, which was Manafort's, and at the moment it just talks about money laundering, tax evasion, and lying. In relation to Ukrainian lobbying, it does not talk about Russian collusion. And that's the big question mark, is did the Trump administration collude with Putin, or did he do this on his own volition without their involvement?
Well, a couple follow-ups on that. Does this suggest to you that finally somebody has been named and somebody has been arrested? Does it suggest to you that there finally are now consequences to the kind of corporate kleptocratic way that the Russian economy appears to be working in too many instances?
Well, there will be more. And I think that Putin way overplayed his hand now, because a lot of people will end up eventually going to jail around this and other stories connected to Russia, for sure.
You've described Putin as the richest man in the world.
Yes.
How do you know that?
Well, I know that through lots of anecdotal stories. I know that through different amounts of money that have been linked to him through the Panama Papers, through the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And I know that through Putin's behavior and what he does, how he lives, et cetera.
What do you think he's worth?
I believe he's worth $200 billion.
And where's his money?
He doesn't keep any money in his own name. All the money is held by people in what I call in trust, which means that they hold it in their name. Why does he hold it in other people's name? Because he doesn't ever want to have anyone have a piece of paper that they can use to blackmail him. So he has to. So he holds $200 billion in the names of other people. And this is a very precarious situation because what happens if he's not president and he calls up and says, hey, Oleg, can you send me some money? And Oleg says, Vladimir who? And so he's got to stay in power in order for this money to be his.
Seems to be doing well at that.
He's doing well at that by basically running roughshod over all the rules of a modern democratic society.
If Putin were no longer in politics, is there any reason to assume that this unholy alliance between the Russian government and the oligarchs would change?
Well, if Putin wasn't in government, then first of all, he would probably end up being in jail. I mean, his only way of staying in jail and potentially alive is to stay as the head of the Russian state. And so there's no other alternative for him. It's an existential threat for him not to be in power.
Let's also understand the organized crime angle on this. I mean, we obviously have organized crime in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, obviously in Russia too. What's the difference?
The main difference in Canada and the United States and other places, you have organized crime and you have government which is fighting organized crime. In Russia, you have organized crime which is the government. And so the Russian government is the largest and most powerful organized crime organization in the world. And I'm not exaggerating to say that it's a merger of organized crime and government. And people don't go into government to serve their people in Russia. They go into government to steal as much money from the Russian state as possible.
In which case, here you are, a book out, which I'm sure will be turned into a movie. It reads like a Jean Le Carré thriller. Terrific read. You are traveling all over the world, essentially blowing the whistle on Putin. What kind of a threat do you think you present to him?
Well, I create a threat to all of his net worth. And I mean, the Magnitsky law, which has now been passed in 4 countries, and we're working on many others, will freeze his assets and make it impossible for him to travel at some point in the future. And so he's personally affected by this, and he's personally furious about this. And he's personally acting in every way possible to try to destroy me.
Don't take this question the wrong way, but why are you still alive?
I'm still alive because at the moment he hasn't figured out how to kill me without getting caught. He doesn't want consequences to killing me.
You're convinced that you're on his death list?
They've threatened me. Dmitry Medvedev at the World Economic Forum. Dmitry Medvedev he's the prime minister, previously the president when Putin was the prime minister. He was asked by a number of journalists, including Chrystia Freeland, who was in the room at the time. They said, what's the story on Sergei Magnitsky? And he got angry and he said, it's a shame that Sergei Magnitsky is dead and Bill Browder is still alive and running around.
Medvedev said
this comes from the Prime Minister of Russia. Yeah. We've received death threats on a number of other occasions. I've had kidnapping threats. I've had extradition threats, arrest threats, lawsuits, criminal cases. There's probably 250 people in Moscow working just on destroying my life.
How are they doing?
They're not doing so well so far. I'm sitting here strong and proud.
We have a little bit of time left, and I want to talk about the bigger picture, because while your transformation from sort of capitalist running dog, if you like, to championer of human rights around the world is a fascinating transformation, the bigger picture is your work on behalf of Sergei Magnitsky and having these laws passed in various countries around the world has contributed to, I think it's fair to say, a worsening of relations between Canada and Russia, between the United States and Russia. Other countries that bring in these laws will also probably see their relations deteriorate as well. And I'd like to get some better understanding from you of why you think worsened macro relations between our two nations is worth it in order to seek the understandable justice that you want for your friend.
That's a great question. So first of all, we have not done anything to worsen relations. By Putin invading Crimea and invading Ukraine, by him bombing innocent women and children in Syria with chemical weapons, or supporting Assad, who's doing that, by cheating in the Olympics, by laundering money, by killing his opponents in country and abroad, those are the things that worsen the relations. What we're trying to do is just create one small real consequence for him for doing all those things. And so this is not about, and by the way, Putin doesn't respect or appreciate appeasement. So what's the logical choice for taking that question, which is to do nothing? And Putin just laughs at people who do nothing, who are just trying to, like, suck up to him. That doesn't work.
Well, let me characterize it a different way. Russia, you would acknowledge, Russia is a great power. It is a great and historic power in the world and has been for, obviously, centuries. Russia considers the Magnitsky Act, never mind an inconvenience, humiliating. From a macho, we're a great power point of view, they feel humiliated by the Magnitsky Act. So again, is it problematic in terms of our potential cooperation with Russia to solve world problems to have you doing what you're doing?
Yes, of course. So Russia, they're not contributing to solving any world problem. What they're doing is creating the world problems. And so we're trying to create a little bit of leverage so that, and Putin only respects one thing, which is hard power. He understands a boot on the throat. And this is what we have here. This is not about making nice with Russia. This is about creating real leverage that he personally feels because he's got this money, so that so that we can in some way contain him. And let me present the alternative. The alternative is that we could have a military confrontation with Russia. Why don't we have a financial confrontation with Russia? Let's fight them with banks, not with tanks.
Banks, not tanks. Okay, that's a clever line, but I wonder if is there a way for you to seek justice for your friend, which you understandably want, while at the same time not have it contribute to a worsening of relations with a country that, for example, now, this is not an example that America or the UK would be interested in, but we share an enormous northern frontier, the Arctic. We share that with Russia. The notion of Canada making any progress on issues related to the Arctic probably is not going to happen if we're passing Magnitsky-style laws and humiliating them. What do we do about that?
I guarantee you'll have a better negotiation on the Arctic by having some real muscle and having a Magnitsky-style law than you'll have sort of going weekly up to Putin and said, please be nice to me.
Because he only respects force?
That's correct.
And you think this is the appropriate way to meet that?
There's no question, and if you ask anybody who knows Putin well, and they'll tell you that's the right answer.
Would you acknowledge that Russia is a significant power in the world that we ought to be trying to have better relations with?
I think that Russia is a significant power in the world that needs to learn how to get along with everybody else. It's not us trying to make them feel better. It's us trying to get them to come along and do the right thing. And the only way you can do that is by using real power. This is not about friendship. This is not about being nice. This is about real power politics. And I can tell you, as the U.S. as an example, they had the same reaction when the Magnitsky Act passed in the U.S. They were huffing and puffing and doing all this kind of stuff. And you know what? John Kerry, even after he didn't want this thing to pass, he was on the phone with Sergei Lavrov every week doing all the same stuff he always did. The Russians, it's all bluster. They're playing with a weak hand. They're great bluffers in a game of poker. They have a pair of twos. We have a full house. Russia's an economy the size of Italy. And they're busy going around trying to disrupt every international negotiation. They're vetoing everything at the United Nations Security Council. This is a country that needs to be contained, not appeased.
This is a country that was not bluffing as it related to eastern Ukraine. They went into eastern Ukraine. There have been thousands of casualties as a result. I get you when you say banks, not tanks.
And let me tell you something. In eastern Ukraine, if the world had not come in with those sanctions, they would have gone further into Ukraine. It's the sanctions that worked. That's what Putin respects.
Okay, let's look forward. What do you anticipate as you, crystal ball gazing is a little bit unreliable, but you've been on this for a very long time. What do you see in the years ahead in terms of your quest to champion further Magnitsky Acts?
Well, it's an absolutely beautiful thing that Canada has passed the Magnitsky Act, because previously, when it was just the United States standing by themselves, a lot of people in a lot of small countries said, the U.S. is a very unilateral place. It's a superpower. We don't want to follow the U.S. to do something. But Canada is different. Canada is the country. It's a honest broker. It's a moral leader. And when people look at Canada doing this, they say, you know what? If Canada can do it, so can we. And so I believe that Canada has set off what will potentially be a chain reaction here.
I want in our last minute, I don't know if people can see this. Can you get a shot of this, camera 3? That's my guest today. Something happened to the fuzzy hair.
Unfortunately not here anymore.
But the question is, you were not a great student. You had a very slow start in life. You hadn't really found your mission, turning into a human rights champion around the globe.
It's the most unlikely thing that you could ever imagine. But I couldn't have a more meaningful and worthwhile mission than I have right now, which is to get justice for my lawyer, and to get justice for a lot of other people. Sergei Magnitsky's legacy will be to create consequences for bad guys. And not just in Russia, let me point out. The Magnitsky law applies everywhere in the world to bad guys in Venezuela, Iran, China, wherever. And if guards start behaving better in the prison for Offski, if people start to think there's a consequence for doing bad stuff, then Sergei Magnitsky's legacy will have saved lives, and I will have done a meaningful thing in my life.
It's an absolute page-turner. Red Notice, a true story of high finance, murder, and one man's fight for justice, and that one man is Bill Browder. And we're grateful you came into TVO tonight and shared your views with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.